In an office designed in the fashion of England's Regency era, sits a woman who is dressed according to the theme. She wonders about the average Jane Austen fanatic. What makes them so different from casual admirers of Jane Austen's novels? Perhaps it is the Regent style, fashion and etiquettes that pique their interest, and eventually turn them into a passionate Austen fan. Or is it the number of times they have read and reread her novels? Maybe it is their immense liking of Mr. Darcy, the male lead of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and one of the most beloved characters of all time. Such is the case of Jane Hayes. Despite living in America, she is charmed by the Regency manners. She goes to Regency-themed cafes, to Austen's English classes, has collected numerous merches, and even makes her boyfriends watch the popular movie adaptations of the novels. Even though they get fed up and leave. She'd rather kiss Mr. Darcy's cardboard cutout anyway. Her ex-boyfriend rudely interrupts her while she's working to try and get back with her. He acts like he's doing her a favor because she's crossed her 30s and he's the best she can get among men around her age. This is her final straw. The woman in the Regency office says Austen's die-hard fans usually find their way to what is called Austenland, where one gets a real-time Austen experience. That is where Jane plans to go. Jane's friend, Molly, is not sure if this is a good idea, despite the travel agent assuring them that it is a high-class vacation that would be life-changing for Jane, as she gets to play the heroine of her own Jane Austen story. Every stay in Austenland ends with a ball, which is when you are supposed to find your happily ever after. Molly thinks it would be a waste to spend all her savings on it, but Jane insists she take the chance because this is a one-time opportunity for her to live her Austen dream. Molly thinks she's past being a fan and has gotten to the point where she's addicted and obsessed. She is proven right by Jane's bedroom that is decorated with Austen's books, merch, paintings, toys, and 19th century artifacts. Molly changes her mind because she thinks if Jane's vacation turns out to be disappointing, her fantasies will be ruined and she won't be as obsessed anymore. They decide to make a bet where if Jane returns dissatisfied, she'll have to get rid of all her decorations. In spite of her dislike for Jane's obsession, Molly makes her a dress as a farewell gift. Jane appreciates it, even though it's not from the Regency era. She wears the dress with the cape and bonnet to the airport. When she arrives in England, she waits at the spot where she would be picked up from. There, she meets another American lady who is also a guest at the Darcy place, as she calls it. She doesn't know what Pride and Prejudice is. She claims she's going there because she'd look good in those fancy gowns. Soon, Jane realizes they were not supposed to come in costume. The woman is delighted to meet Jane and introduces herself as her character, Elizabeth Charming. She suggests Jane name herself Miss Pepperpot or Miss Wiggly Wiggins. They're picked up by a handsome man in a 1920s Rolls-Royce, and Elizabeth first assumes the car is from the 1800s, then wonders if it's the Grand Prix from the movie Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. They leave the city and drive towards the woods where they make a stop at a small house which serves as the office. They are greeted by Mrs. Wattlesbrook, the owner, who welcomes them to the Regency world. Jane suggests a name for herself, but Mrs. Wattlesbrook has already decided on it. She will be called Miss Jane Erstwhile. Martin, the driver, is asked to replace their luggage since they will need a new set of clothes and accessories. Mrs. Wattlesbrook informs Jane that since she has chosen the basic copper package, and the other ladies have chosen the Platinum Elite package, she'll miss out on some of the services offered. It doesn't make much difference to Jane, however, because she is thrilled to just be there. All the guests will be assigned an actor to serve as their romantic lead. There is a policy that forbids them from touching the actors, other than the social gestures. The guests are also supposed to be well-mannered and rid of modern things. Otherwise, their stay will be cut short. They begin to get dressed and are helped by the maids. The numerous layers of clothes take a while, and Jane discreetly shoves her cell phone into her petticoat. Elizabeth gets to choose from a variety of fancy and vibrant gowns, while Jane's options are a little dull. She shakes off the weird feeling and walks out. The carriage can only take limited passengers, so Jane must sit at the back. Soon they reach their destination. The footmen and housemaids line up as they enter the manor. Elizabeth's platinum-level room is huge and gorgeous, decorated with what she calls old-fashioned items. She's very excited and Jane loves it too. Jane is quite pleased with her copper-level room as well, even though it's in the servants' headquarters. Jane wanders into the ballroom and fantasizes about a man asking her to dance. She is then called to go meet everyone else. The first person they see is a man who covers his face with a book immediately. Elizabeth calls him one of the Darcy people. Jane is surprised when she's introduced as an orphan of no fortune who Mrs. Wattlesbrook took in, while Elizabeth is a wealthy woman. Colonel Andrews, son of the Earl of Denton, greets them first, and then the visibly disinterested man, Henry Nobley, who is Mrs. Wattlesbrook's nephew. Elizabeth is glad they both have a partner each, but she speaks too soon. There is another guest named Amelia Hartright. She gushes about finally meeting other women after being stuck with the men for so long. Mrs. Wattlesbrook also introduces her husband, who seems quite drunk. They sit down and Amelia says she looks forward to a walk in the garden, and Elizabeth makes a flirty remark directed at Henry. Jane tries to cover for her, but Elizabeth goes overboard with her next move, trying to get Henry to look at what's gotten into her eye. Henry is clearly uncomfortable, so Colonel Andrews offers to tend to her eye instead. He concludes she has fire in her eyes. A very lavish-looking dinner is then served. Amelia asks Henry if he's got something on his mind, and he curtly responds that he hasn't. Elizabeth encourages Jane to try talking like the actors, in formal, Old English. She asks Henry whether he enjoys dancing. He says he doesn't, but Amelia disagrees, saying he has surely danced with many women before. Mrs. Wattlesbrook gives Henry a look and he obliges to dance with Amelia at the ball. Jane can't believe she's actually in her fantasy world, even after spitting out her food when she learned they were sheep's eyeballs. The topic shifts from dancing being enjoyable only when you're fond of your partner to social interactions. Henry thinks people interact with other people despite any obvious vulgar impressions just for courtesy. Jane argues it's not nice to make early judgments about people or their characters, that is to be prejudiced. It's unavoidable to have firm opinions about people upon first meeting them, according to him. Jane remarks that her first impression of Henry was rather good, which is a disappointment now. Amelia empathizes with Jane in the matter of finding love, which leaves Jane confused. It seems that Mrs. Wattlesbrook did some research on her guests, and she found out about Jane's little luck with relationships. To top it off, Amelia sadly pouts at her to express how upset she is to see Jane at her age without a husband or kids, and reminds her that she's running out of time. Henry looks at her unbelievably while Jane is shocked and embarrassed. She gets up and excuses herself. Elizabeth follows her to console her. She has gone through unlucky relationships and relates to her feelings. But this place won't disappoint her and will make her forget about all her bad past experiences. Elizabeth feels bad that her room is so far and it's probably scary at night, but Jane is alright with that. She also tips her not to use the chamber pots because toilets with flushes exist as an exception to the no modern stuff rule. For the walk in the garden, the two guests are paired with the two men, leaving Jane by herself. Andrews invites her, but she decides she'd rather go find some place to sit. Jane goes to the stables, which is only for staff, and begins to read. She is startled by a stack of straw thrown by the stable boy, who is Martin. He apologizes and they make small conversation. He asks if she's from America. He drops the formal English because it sounds funny and he's not one of the actors either. Jane jokes that she's not supposed to be talking to the servants either, but there she is. She initially thought she'd be really good at everything, considering how intimate she is with Austen's books and the Regency manners. He jokes that she might need a coach. They are interrupted by Andrews and Henry, who came looking for Jane. Jane is a little flustered, explaining herself. When Andrews insists she spill whatever secret she's holding, Henry scolds him for bugging her as she's visibly unwell. Andrews then begins to suggest disturbing 19th century medicinal treatments. Henry just asks him to shut up. They are supposed to go on a hunting excursion on horseback. Elizabeth arrives riding a horse, terribly excited about the real horses and real guns. During hunting, Martin coaches Jane on the basics of holding a gun and firing. Henry watches them with Amelia by his side. Shot in the sky as the three women fire. Only Jane manages to hit it, and then she hits the next two as well. Everyone is quite impressed with her talent, although it's her first time using a gun. In Elizabeth's defense, she didn't know they were supposed to really shoot the. On the way back, Jane's horse suddenly stops moving forward. Martin takes a look at it and decides he'll have to fetch her a different horse and goes off, promising to be back real soon. Jane is frustrated with the shortcomings of the copper package. She walks a little further when it starts raining and thundering. Henry finds her and offers to take her back since he can't leave a woman alone in the woods. She tries telling him that Martin should be back soon, but he insists. For them to be able to ride through the storm, she'll have to straddle the horse, so he tears up the bottom of her gown. When they make it back, they are a mess. All drenched, dress ripped, and she almost falls trying to get off the horse. Henry gets mad at Martin for leaving Jane stranded in the woods. Amelia comes looking for Henry and is horrified by Jane's appearance. Jane awkwardly excuses herself and rushes to her room. While everyone plays cards at the table, Jane is sat doodling on the sofa and Mrs. Wattlesbrook marks it not proper. Henry is reading as usual and Andrews is entertaining the ladies with his phony compliments. Mr. Wattlesbrook makes weird comments about Jane's earthy scent. Jane says she's not wearing any perfume. He concludes that it must be her essence. Elizabeth says she puts her face in the fire at night to achieve her smooth, glowing skin. Jane walks out and heads towards the stable. She hears music and Martin singing along. When she knocks on the shed door, he turns off the music immediately. He asks if she's lost and she claims to have just heard the music while on a walk. He rushes her in before his trumpet gets confiscated due to it being a modern instrument. He's on Mrs. Wattlesbrook's watch list since he's prone to breaking rules. He jokingly asks if Jane is spying for her. Martin apologizes for not getting back to her quickly in the afternoon. She says it would have been no big deal even if Henry didn't help her. Martin says the actors are paid to do such heroic things and they even have a gallantry award every month. She requests to turn the music back on. She appreciates his taste in music and he jokes that he likes her taste in gowns. She cannot take herself seriously with the costumes and all. They slow dance as he sings. She likes his dance moves and he claims none of the heroic actors could pull those off. They are interrupted by loud thumping. He takes her to the stables where a distressed pregnant horse is. He calms her a little bit and asks Jane to fetch some straw, because the horse is about to give birth. Jane tries to pick up the stack, but it's too heavy. He shouts for her to hurry, but she can't get anything but a handful of the straw. She takes that back anyway, but the little baby horse is out already. Jane is really impressed by Martin's skills. Martin gives her a little kiss before she goes back. While the men are out supposedly hunting, the three guests spend their time reading and sewing, which were one of the popular pastimes of Regency women. Elizabeth's patience hangs loose with these activities. Amelia asks Jane how she feels being left behind all the time, but her voice and tone lack real concern. Jane again excuses herself and goes to find Martin. She jokingly pretends she's out to read, so he says she's not allowed to read down there. He sarcastically asks her to go back to the house since there are so many men paid to adore her over there, even the butler. He, however, pulls her back when she tries to go find that butler. He gives in and they spend the afternoon together. He is awfully romantic as he takes her boat riding, plays music for her, and even gets into the water to get her bonnet. They are comfortable around each other, joking and messing about. Henry watches her come back to the manor. During dinner, Mrs. Wattlesbrook is pleased to announce the arrival of Captain George east of the West Indies. He is a well-built and a pretty good-looking man. He was recently made captain after his terrific show of bravery against French warships, especially with outnumbered men. The ladies attentively listen to his story while Henry thinks it's not even believable. George then shifts his attention to Jane, whom he finds most beautiful. Martin is passing by when he notices Jane giggling as George plants kisses up her arm. He walks off angrily. Henry is annoyed and gets up while accidentally knocking down George on the way. When everyone leaves, Jane sneaks up behind Martin at the stables and hugs him. He rudely asks if she couldn't find anyone else to flirt with. After he saw her having fun with the actors, he was annoyed and disappointed because he thought she was different from the usual, easy and desperate guests they had. Jane angrily says she probably does enjoy that kind of stuff. She wonders if they're breaking up, but he doesn't seem to have thought of what they had as an actual relationship. He walks off and Jane is left confused and upset. Martin joins the actors chilling in the Pleasure Dome, which is a sort of a modern getaway for them. Henry borrows George's power socket, which compels him to turn off the TV, which was playing his very own daily soap. Martin jokes that his horses give him less trouble than the women give the actors. He asks everyone what they think of Jane. Henry refrains from answering, but George thinks she's hot and Andrews thinks she's peculiar. Martin himself thinks she's just all right. Amelia performs for everyone. She sings quite well, but the piano is recorded. Andrews encourages Jane to play next, though she tries to refuse. She only knows one song, and so she plays and sings Hot in Here. The lyrics are a bit too much for the Regency etiquette. Within a few moments, Mrs. Wattlesbrook jumps up and turns off the piano. Jane sighs, gets up and saunters away. She's going towards the stables when she is startled by Henry, who asks her where she's going. She jokes that she almost became a ninja because ninja moves were her reflex. When she hears Martin singing, she begins to leave, but Henry stops her. He thinks it's not ladylike to be strolling in dark places at night and frolicking about servants. She is offended at his choice of words. Before he could explain himself and how he thinks there's something not right about Martin, Jane interrupts him and sarcastically thanks him for his concern. He thinks she's being ridiculous and she calls him insufferable as they part ways. When Jane returns to the house, Mr. Wattlesbrook walks to her, inviting her for a game of whist. Jane tries to avoid him and rush to her room, but he gets a hold of her and tries to kiss her forcefully. So she steps on his foot and kicks him off of herself. Henry runs in, and Andrews rushes downstairs upon hearing noises. Andrews is annoyed that it's Mr. Wattlesbrook causing trouble again. Mr. Wattlesbrook shouts that she attacked him. Henry thinks that's pretty obvious since she's a ninja. Andrews picks the old man up and threatens him that the men won't be covering for him anymore. Henry asks Jane if she's alright and if she can make her way to her room safely. She can, as long as there's no more lurking Mr. Wattlesbrooks around, she jokes. Henry believes she can take down Andrews if she has to. He asks once again if there's anything he could do for her. When she says she's good, they both bid each other goodnight and part. Jane calls Molly to tell her how the copper package has been treating her. It probably doesn't even have a happily ever after storyline for her. She does feel like she wasted all her money, just like Molly predicted. Molly suggests she quit now and ask for a refund and buy her car back. But Jane doesn't want to leave this trip because her unfinished story would probably haunt her. She then decides she's going to take charge of her own story and make progress. Austen heroines get engaged by the end of the book, and she is going to make sure she does too. Elizabeth suggests she go for George, since he's good-looking and successful. But Jane's dresses are too simple and do not make her look attractive. She asks Elizabeth for help, and she's more than happy to help. Elizabeth sneaks some of Amelia's dresses because they'd fit Jane, and she has tons of them and is too dumb to notice. She loves stealing things from her. Elizabeth dresses her up and does her makeup and hair, even helps her practice her British accent, although she only knows the modern words. Jane eventually starts acting her part, and she mimics the Regency lady pretty well, charming everyone at the house. Jane makes a graceful entry that makes all the men tip their hats. As they play golf, Jane and Andrews look over at Henry chatting with Amelia as she laughs. Andrews points out how Henry is quite the ladies' man, but he doesn't speak much often and he's more relaxed around the men. Jane wonders if he hears them talk about him, and Henry affirms it because they're loud enough. Andrews asks him to stop being so stiff. Henry then proceeds to scold George for using his shirt instead of a handkerchief to wipe Elizabeth's mouth. In reference to what Andrews said, Henry admits that he doesn't find it exciting to indulge in conversation with women. Jane jokes that he's probably still single because of that. Henry strikes back saying he doesn't see a ring on her finger either. It's George's turn to scold him. Jane is a good sport about it, however, and she admits she's single because all the good men are fictional. Henry argues that there are no good women either. He says they profess loyalty and run off to Brazil with your friend while you're away lecturing in Switzerland. The example seems too specific and is probably his personal experience. Mrs. Wattlesbrook arrives with luggage in a carriage. Jane recognizes it to be hers. Mrs. Wattlesbrook has found Jane's cell phone, and since that violates the rules, her vacation shall be terminated. Jane accepts her decision and prepares to leave when suddenly, Amelia chimes in. She claims it's her cell phone that she accidentally carried in, and Jane offered to keep it with her. Mrs. Wattlesbrook gets flustered and dismisses her decision since it was just an accident. She even pleads Amelia to continue to stay until the end. George pops up to say that Jane isn't allowed to leave since they haven't even got to know each other. Later, Jane thanks Amelia for saving her. Amelia asks her to follow her to a room. Now that they've become close, Amelia wants to reveal a secret to Jane. She was engaged to Captain East last year at the ball, but because he was a poor sailor, her father broke off the engagement without her permission. But if she tries to explain it to him now, he'll assume she wants to get back only because he's a wealthy captain. Jane always thought Amelia liked Henry, but she was wrong. Amelia wants Jane to help her get back with George. When Jane claims there's nothing she could do about that, Amelia passively threatens to expose her regarding the cell phone, and also regarding stealing, as she recognizes her dress which Jane is wearing. The three guests are busy designing bonnets when Andrews introduces an additional program. Mrs. Wattlesbrook has written a story and they are all to rehearse and perform the theatrical based on it, since they have some time left until the ball. Henry immediately refuses because he thinks it's just so embarrassing. George suggests they let the women choose their partners. Elizabeth chooses Andrews as expected. Jane wants to pick George, but she looks at Amelia's face and is reminded of her threat, so she goes for Henry. Henry perks up after hearing his name. Since they're partnered up, Jane and Henry go someplace to rehearse their lines. They squeeze in through the bushes to get to the garden. Jane suggests they try not to annoy each other for the little time they'll be spending together. Henry admits she doesn't annoy him, rather she makes him nervous. She is surprised when he makes small talk, asking if she's enjoying her stay so far. She likes the house, but she feels it's like a corset. It looks good, but it's hard to relax in. Henry finishes her sentences for her. There's so much to love about Austenland. The civility and manners, the grandeur along with the simplicity, the men and the women and the paintings too. Speaking of paintings, Henry takes a look at Jane's sketchbook. She claims it's just silly drawings. He is amused to find more of his sketches than anyone else's. She admits she's been trying to study him, but she didn't get to know much other than the fact that he's the resident Mr. Darcy, every girl's fantasy. When he asks if he's her fantasy, she just tells him he plays his character very well. When they're done rehearsing their lines, they notice Amelia and George making out. They don't seem to be just acting. Jane is concerned about Amelia in case she's actually in love with him. Henry calls it a dangerous game. Jane cannot tell what's true and what's not. But if they truly end up in love with each other, what is to happen to them after the theatrical? Henry claims if he was asked whether it's possible to confuse truth with fantasy a week ago, he would have said yes. Jane doesn't quite catch that, because she's busy feeling cold, so Henry gives her his jacket. Jane runs into Martin, who asks her where the other guests are. She informs him they're in their private whist lesson, which is just for platinum packages. He gives her a kiss and apologizes. In the evening, the play starts and Elizabeth emerges as Aphrodite. Her mispronounced words are corrected by the chief guest of the show, Mrs. Wattlesbrook. Then enter the two couples with their problems and Andrews at last, forgetting his line. Aphrodite shoots an arrow that hits Amelia's eye. Nobody, other than Mrs. Wattlesbrook, seems to take the play seriously, but the actors have fun acting out the scenes. When Henry's character lies with a sword through his chest, apparently on the verge of demise, he confesses his love to Jane, rather than Jane's character. Martin watches the play too, but he's not quite amused. The play ends when all of the characters die. Mrs. Wattlesbrook loves it. Amelia and Elizabeth break into a fight because of the accidental injury, and also because Elizabeth calls her flat-chested. George carries a sobbing Amelia away. Martin catches Jane's gaze, but she goes backstage to Henry and suggests they get out of the chaotic mess quickly. They run all the way to her room, and they run because a man and a woman shouldn't be alone together unless they are in motion, according to Jane. So it isn't appropriate for him to stay for long in her bedroom. Jane tells him she had a great time. When he's outside, he stops to ask if she could reserve her first 2 dances of the ball with him, and she agrees. He then asks to be let in again, just to tell her that he feels certain about something when he looks at her. He softly kisses her hand and leaves. At the ball, Jane and Elizabeth descend the stairs looking gorgeous. Amelia, however, got her injured eye infected and patched up. She almost jumps on Elizabeth angrily, but George takes her away. Andrews comes to get Elizabeth with his cheesy compliments and gets a kiss forced on him. Jane spots Martin. He compliments her look, and he looks pretty clean himself. Jane asks about the baby horse and he jokes that it's talking now and he's asking for the girl who couldn't fetch the straw. Martin suddenly admits he's into her and would like to get out of there. Before he could finish, Henry shows up for his dance. Jane takes his hand, mouthing an apology to Martin. Henry says Jane looks stunning as they join the dance. When she asks if he's having fun, he says he's incredibly delighted but not at all because of the ball. He stops dancing abruptly to tell her something, which he's not supposed to. He fears his aunt might destroy him if he does. Before he could say anything, Andrews loudly proposes to Elizabeth and she accepts and they make out. Henry tries to take Jane away from them when they also see George propose to Amelia. Once outside, Henry asks if Jane remembers their first encounter. He was horrible, he admits, but he was just nervous. He certainly wasn't intending on falling in love with her, but he has. And he cannot imagine leaving Austenland without her. He pleads her to tell him if he has a chance, or any hope. Jane is taken aback, but she's also surprised at her own feelings. She tells Henry he was right about it being a very dangerous game, and she doesn't want to play this game anymore. She wants something real. Saying that, she moves through the people, finds Martin and asks if she still wants to get away. He does, and they get in the car and drive away. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sobs as Andrews reprimands her for touching him inappropriately. Jane tells Martin about Henry's proposal, that Mrs. Wattlesbrook probably put him to. Jane admits his character was dreamy and she found herself thinking some of it was real, albeit it was a foolish thing to do. Martin jokes that he wouldn't marry Henry anyway because he has bad knees. He says Mrs. Wattlesbrook hires the best actors around. Jane says she's glad Martin is not part of the fantasy land. That makes it easier for her to let go of her Austen dream easily. Her flight leaves the next day, but she could postpone it. He would love that, and he would love to see her wear something other than 19th century costumes. Elizabeth will be staying longer than Jane, so they bid goodbyes at the manor. Jane thanks her for everything and gives her a sewn portrait of herself. Elizabeth will be overlooking the new guests and making sure they all know that Andrews is taken. She's also planning to ask Mrs. Wattlesbrook if she can buy the whole place. Jane thinks that's a great idea. About Andrews, however, Jane wants to tell her something but ends up saying that he might be perfect for her. Elizabeth jokingly says she thought Jane would say Andrews might be gay. In the carriage, Amelia bids goodbye to everyone and then drops her British accent. Jane is shocked by her real American accent. Amelia owes it to 2 years of private drama lessons. She calls Henry boring as she mentions Jane ending up with him. But he played his character well, she says, because he asked her to pretend the cell phone was hers to save Jane. Amelia also casually mentions that her husband is very old. When Mrs. Wattlesbrook asks Jane if she found romance with any of the men, Jane responds she did, but not with Henry as she was probably meant to. Mrs. Wattlesbrook says Henry was only there to keep Amelia company until George was done filming his TV show. Martin was scripted for Jane from the very beginning. He's an actor, not a servant. He was just taken out of the main roles because things were steaming up, according to Mrs. Wattlesbrook. She says she was sure he would woo Jane, and he did. A litter of kittens does the job for most women, while some require the baby horse to fall for him. Jane is absolutely demolished upon the realization. Mrs. Wattlesbrook asks if she's upset. Jane denies, but asks her not to take it personally when she shuts her business down. She was definitely not the first guest Mr. Wattlesbrook had assaulted. It would be fairly easy to find other complaints and sue them. Mrs. Wattlesbrook is shook. Martin tries getting on Henry's nerves, saying it was too unfortunate he couldn't get Jane, even though she was basically anyone's to have. Henry shoves him angrily but doesn't let it get to him. Martin is ordered to go see Jane at the airport and calm her down, or frankly, convince her not to sue them. When he meets Jane, she recognizes his true intentions right away, even though he tries to seem sincere. He's an actor and a talented one too, but he cannot fool her twice. Somehow Henry reaches the airport as well, as soon as he learns that Martin was assigned to Jane. He warns her not to believe him. He tries to explain that he's not an actor, only a very reluctant standby at his aunt's request. Jane's first week at the manor was his first week as well, so he had been genuine all the time. Martin tries to get her attention again, but Jane lashes out at him for calling her Janie. He has no right to calm her down since he was paid to kiss her. She asks if he has a supply of pregnant horses just for his little show. In a moment, Henry and Martin get into an argument about who was genuine and who wasn't. Jane learns Martin is from New Zealand, which adds onto the list of his deceitful actions. The three of them eventually get into a brawl in the middle of the airport, but Jane puts a stop to it. She yells to the whole of England that she's officially done with all of it. Henry stops her one more time to explain himself. She just tells him it doesn't matter, that he wasn't real. He was perfect anyway. She thanks him and leaves while he stands there dejected. Meanwhile, Martin flirts with a random woman. As per the bet, Jane starts to Austenizing her room. When the doorbell rings, she thinks it's Molly, who's supposed to come over soon. But it's Henry. She's surprised to see him. He returns her book that she left behind. She assures him she's not going to report Mrs. Wattlesbrook since she went overboard by sending him all the way to her. But Henry says she didn't send him. Jane begins to say something, but she's not sure what his real name is. Turns out, Henry Nobley is his real name. He's a history professor. He thought his aunt's profession was weird and distasteful, but he actually enjoyed stepping into history for a while. A world where love is simple and lasting, which is what they're both looking for. More importantly, he loves her, most ardently. She says he must have been in love with Miss Jane Erstwhile, since he barely knows the real her. Henry insists Jane Erstwhile was the real her. Because she cannot act to save a life, he had seen it at the theatrical. Jane claims he was horrible at it too, which is exactly what he's trying to say. They're both incapable of pretending, so whatever they had was surely real. She did say she wanted something real. He pleads for a chance at them, at the possibility that he's the one who can make her happy. Jane almost gives in, but she realizes he's just her fantasy. But she's got it all wrong. She's his fantasy. They finally kiss, and it seems like a happily ever after kiss. In the epilogue, there's a carnival at Austenland, now owned by Elizabeth. She's also living her true fantasy. Jane and Henry are visiting too, seemingly having a great time. Mr. Wattlesbrook is working as a cleaner, though he's still with Mrs. Wattlesbrook. Captain East is the star of Austenland, and Amelia shoves her husband away to watch him. Martin is out flirting as expected. At the end, Jane and Henry pop their heads in the Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy cardboard cutouts.